Hello, everyone. Welcome to Live Better Longer, Sex Differences and Aging. This is part of a webinar series about healthy aging, brought to you today by the American Federation for Aging Research, Prevention, and Men's Health. I am Sarah Smith, the editor-in-chief of Prevention, which is a job I love because I get to learn from so many fascinating health experts for our magazine, for our site, books, and events like this. I'm so happy to be joined today by my colleague at Men's Health, Spencer Dukoff.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm so grateful to be a part of this conversation today. I am the Deputy Editor of Content Strategy at Men's Health, which is a very wonky title that basically just says that I lead audience development efforts across all of our platforms. I work both on the print magazine and on the website as well. And yeah, I couldn't be more happy to be a part of all of this.
Great. And, in this Live Better Longer webinar series, we are having fascinating conversations with leading experts. So, that we can share not just the latest research around health and aging, but understand how to apply it to our lives. AFAR is a leader in supporting aging research, and the work they're committed to is literally changing people's lives. And I'm proud to partner with them because prevention has been around for 70 years, always at the forefront of health, and we're just fascinated by the science of wellness here.
And just echoing Sarah, Men's Health, we have been a destination for fitness and health and nutrition, wellness news, focusing particularly on men for the past 3 decades, but our entire mission is geared around making men live stronger, faster, better lives. So focusing a lot on vitality and joy, and I feel like a lot of those concepts will come up in our conversation today. So today, Sarah and I are going to be talking to Steve Austad, the Senior Scientific Director of AFAR, and Dena Dubal, the Chair in Aging and Neurodegenerative Diseases in the Department of Neurology at the University of California, San Francisco.
We'll have time for a Q&A with them at the end. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A section at any time. So we're going to get started with this conversation. Dena and Steve, by way of introduction, would you each tell us what got you interested in this field of study? Dena, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Well, first, I'm totally delighted to join you all today for this topic that's near and dear to my heart, and for a topic that affects each of us as we age every day, as men, women, or somewhere on the continuum. And I have a long-standing interest in understanding sex differences in aging. I'll tell you a couple of things. One is that my great-grandmother lived a very long life in a very small town with a lot of epidemic and even famine. In rural India, and she lived almost till 90, and her husband, my great-grandfather, died in his 40s, and her lifespan was double that of his, even though he was a handsome, robust, amazing man. She lived twice as long as him, and I've always been curious what underlies these differences between men and women. I'll tell you another story that's not so heartwarming, but highlights the cultural importance of men versus women around the world in some societies. And that is, I had a grandmother who wished that I was a boy, because I would have just been so much more helpful to the family. And I just remember thinking early on as a child, what is the difference between girls and boys? And why were boys so important? And was there something important about girls too? And so from very early on, I had cultural experiences and family history that led me to want to understand this difference, which I now pursue passionately in understanding lifespan and what it means to be male, female, and so lots to think about. I look forward to the conversation today.
That's great, Dena. Thank you for that glimpse into where your expertise is all rooted in. Thank you. Steve, what about you? Tell us about your background.
Well, I would like to say that I had this really long-standing interest in this topic, but that in fact wouldn't be true. One of the things I kind of pride myself on is paying attention to things that everybody knows, but nobody really thinks about. And this really came out for me when I read a paper about a dozen years ago that came out. It was the first paper that had treated mice with experimental drugs to see if they could make them live longer. And 2 of the drugs did, but only males. It didn't have any effect on females. And at the time that paper came out, I was actually reading an account of the Donner disaster in California. And for listeners who don't know that, this was a group of about 90 pioneers that left the Midwest heading for California. They got some bad advice and bad direction and ended up in the Sierras in the winter and got trapped in the snow. And of these 90 original people, over half of the men died, but fewer than a third of the women died. And so I was reading this account at exactly the time that I was reading this scientific paper that came out. And I thought, there is a really interesting puzzle here. And I hadn't heard much of anyone describing it. And so I thought, this is a real opportunity for research that never occurred to me before. And the more I dug into it, the more interesting it got. And now I think it's one of the most fascinating and really underdeveloped topics in the biology of aging.
Before we dive in, would each of you tell us one fascinating thing about gender that you're looking forward to discussing today?
Go ahead, Dena.
Well, there's so much. Where does one begin? I am really fascinated by something that Steve just touched on, and that is that during times of famine and epidemics, girls will even live longer than boys, even at the young age, that there is something innately biological about increased survival in females. That's true even early on.
Yeah, so I guess my fact would almost play off what Dena just mentioned. And that's the fact that being a prematurely born baby, male sex is a risk factor for all kinds of health problems. And so this difference in the design for survival that the 2 sexes have starts before birth even. It's really quite remarkable. I think we mostly think of this as women having some sort of advantage late in life, but in fact, they have an advantage, a survival advantage throughout life. And I think that's just fascinating.
Yeah,
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I was hoping we could talk about that to start off a little bit, because it's well known, like you said, that women live longer than men. But Steve, could you dive in a little bit more about this idea of women's survival advantage? What does that mean?
Yeah, well, I think it's something that I don't think people were paying a lot of attention to. When I first started digging into this deeply, one of the things that I discovered is that women live longer than men everywhere, and at all historical, every place there's reasonable data, women live longer. And I started thinking, I wonder if this is true very early in life. So I went through all of the data and I found out that survival to age 1, girls do better than boys. Survival to age 5, girls do better than boys. They do it better in undeveloped countries. They do it better in highly industrialized countries. And what exactly it's due to, it's really unlikely to be due to something as simple as hormones. That's the first thing most people think about. In fact, that's the first thing I thought about when I started thinking about this. But at 1 year of age, hormones are not playing, at least the kind of reproductive hormones we think of, not playing a great deal of a role at that age. So this is completely terra incognita as far as I'm concerned. What is it about little girls versus little boys. And I have to say, humans are pretty unique. So one of the things I do is I study lots and lots of different animals. And humans are pretty unique to the extent that it doesn't seem to matter under what condition they live. Women always have this survival advantage. In a lot of other species, women under some, or females, under some circumstances will live longer. And under other circumstances, men might, or males might live longer. But humans, this is one of the most robust features of human biology that we know of.
I think, I was going to say, bouncing off of that, I mean, these issues, I think it would be fair to say are fairly complicated. And I'm curious, Dena, where you feel we are in terms of our understanding of these issues.
Well, we have so much to learn. That's the short of it. We have so much to learn, and there's so much exciting biology to be discovered. It's exciting for many reasons. In the field of aging and in the field, just in biology in general, if we can understand what underlies, what are the mechanisms, what enables women to live longer than men, girls to live longer than boys, then there may be some biology that could be harnessed for resilience against aging and for longer lifespan, for a better lifespan in both men and in women. It's actually critical to both fundamental biology, but also to new pathways in medicine to living longer and better. I just want to highlight what Steve said, in that in every single society, and the United Nations has documented this, in every single society that records mortality, from Sierra Leone to Japan, women live longer, and girls live longer than boys under extreme circumstances. It's very robust in humans, and it's also observed in the animal kingdom, not across the animal kingdom, but female whales live longer than male whales, female lions live longer than male lions. And in some types of mice, under some conditions, female mice will live longer than male mice. We study mice in our lab and have been just really curious and passionate to know, how much do hormones contribute to that female longevity? How much do our sex chromosomes contribute to that longevity? With the sex chromosomes being that females have 2 X chromosomes and males have 1, and they also have a Y chromosome, a major difference between the sexes. How much do these factors contribute to longevity? I can certainly speak more to that as we go along, but these are the types of questions that we can ask, and they may lead us to pathways of biology and medicine that could help us to live longer and better, men and women.
Steve, would you say that males have any longevity advantages?
I would actually. I would not. I don't know if I would say longevity advantages, but there is this well-known paradox. And the paradox is that in later life, men on average are healthier than women. They have fewer things fewer disabilities. They go to the hospital less often. And it's called the mortality morbidity paradox. And it may be simply a question of survival. It may be that the males that were more frail have just died earlier. You know, that something happens, they grab their chest, they fall over. That's kind of the male pattern. But for the survivors, and if you look at the residents of nursing homes later in life, they're overwhelmingly female. And so what I have said is that if we could figure out how to make men live as long as women, and we could make women stay as healthy as well as men, that we'd be a long way into improving the enhancing and prolonging the quality of our lives.
You know, Dena, as we're talking about men and women and boys and girls, can you speak to why we're talking about sex differences and we're not saying gender differences?
It's an important point, and it's a good time to just to define sex and gender, and also to acknowledge limitations in the study of sex and gender. So sex refers to biologic sex. for the presence of the XX versus XY, male versus female, the presence of ovaries versus testes, and their influence on biology would be sex biology, and a sex difference would lead to a sex difference. Now, gender is our cultural expression of biologic sex. So mice don't have gender, humans have gender. And gender, and when we say sex, that's quite the binary, it's male or female. But the truth is that gender is not a binary at all. There is a major continuum of sex, sexuality, and the expression of sex in the human condition. So I would say this is that this is a limitation in our study of sex biology is really our inability to really incorporate gender into the study, the cultural expression of sex. I think this is some of the future of where sex and gender research will lead us. But we're really speaking about biologic contributions to differences between males and females. Again, the idea that there's a spectrum of gender is absolutely true and not really incorporated into this model of sex difference.
That's helpful. Thank you. Since we're comparing male and female biology today, Spencer and I thought it would be interesting to ask you both to compare some other longevity factors through the lens of the sex differences, right? So to start, I thought we could talk about hormones versus genetics. Is one of these playing a larger role? Dena, why don't you start us off, but Steve, please feel free to share your insights on that too.
Yeah. Well, as Steve mentioned earlier, we automatically think about our hormones as a major difference between the sexes. And that is true, but it is not the only difference between the sexes. And the question is, how much does it contribute to longevity for both males or for females? And we really don't know the answer to that. There's some interesting pieces from biology that do tell us that hormones contribute to lifespan. And that is, for example, when dogs are castrated or gonadectomized, as we do for most domestic dogs, there is evidence that actually helps them to live longer than uncastrated or gonadectomized dogs, leading us to believe that hormones are influencing lifespan, maybe in a negative way. There's also evidence, I think it's debatable how good the evidence is, but there is evidence that eunuchs, the populations of eunuchs which have been castrated, have lived longer than the general population, leading us to wonder whether the removal of hormones was leading to increased lifespan. Now, there are many reasons why other reasons why eunuchs may be living longer, including a safer life, higher education, and other social factors. Now, we really wanted to test this precisely and ask, could hormones actually causally affect longevity? And so we did an experiment in mice that I'd love to share today. It's an unconventional experiment in which we essentially created 4 different types of mice. We have mice that are XX, that's the female genetics, and then they have the female gonads, ovaries. But through genetic gymnastics and a little bit of genetic engineering, we made XX mice, female genetics, but that were male with gonadally male. So the testes, testosterone, and they behaved as male mice would, but they were XX. And then the flip side, we have mice that are XY, that's the male genetics, but with female gonads, ovaries, and then the typical XY males with testes. So 4 different types of mice, 4 different, you might say, sexes of mice. And then we just observed them over several years and asked, who live longer and what influenced their lifespan. And what we found in our experiments is that the XX mice, the mice that had female genetics, didn't matter if they grew up with ovaries, didn't matter if they grew up with testes. It was the XX mice that lived longer than the XY mice. Now, the hormones had an influence, but the main statistical effect was that of being XX. And this was really an exciting and major demonstration that our sex chromosomes could have something to contribute to lifespan. Now, these studies were in mice. It's always hard to know how to extrapolate that to humans, but in biology, sex chromosomes do contribute to lifespan, as demonstrated by this unconventional genetic experiment in mice.
That is fascinating. I was literally on the edge of my seat as I was waiting for you to say how.
No longer.
Yeah, that's amazing. Steve, is there anything you want to add or bring
Well,
up?
I makes me feel very good because at one of my going away party for one of the universities that I used to work at, they gave me an honorary extra X chromosome as a gift when I lived. So maybe that means that I'm actually going to live longer. I'd be delighted to that. No, I just wanted to mention the eunuch experiment. They weren't experiments, but what strikes me, Dena's absolutely right. The quality of the data are a little bit shaky, but the magnitude of the difference reported is absolutely striking. And the best study, which compared eunuchs in the royal court in Korea with other members of the royal court, so getting over about a 300-year period, the difference in longevity was almost 20 years. So it was enormous. And so I don't think most of us really want to think about that too carefully. But certainly hormones have been assumed to be a key factor in aging for a long time. There was a really embarrassing period of aging research in the late 19th, early 20th century where people were doing things like getting implanted with goat testicles or ovaries or getting vasectomized, both of which were thought to have hormonal effects that could promote long life. A lot of this was actually done on prisoners against their will. And we didn't learn a lot from that, except whatever they did, if they were implanting goat testicles or vasectomizing male prisoners, they were always finding a positive effect for everything from heart attacks to skin problems. So we have to kind of beware, I think, when we talk about this, about a lot of old, bad, but very seductive science, which really turns it into a very simple problem. All we need to do is top up the hormones, or maybe we just need to take away the hormones and everything will be fine. I think what Dena's work with the mice has shown us is this is complicated. Even in mice, this is complicated. Maybe hormones are playing some role, but there's a lot of genes on the X chromosome. There's over 1,000 genes and a few on the Y chromosome. And we really don't know the extent to which the action of those genes on those sex chromosomes may be playing major roles in this. But we're learning more and more about that.
I'm curious if we can take kind of the lens that we're applying for hormones and genes and transition into physical health versus mental health, and comparing those two differences. So Steve, if you want to start, but I'd love to hear from both.
Well, Dena's the neurologist in the group here, but let me just say that both of these are important. For someone like myself who thinks about animal health as much as I think about human health, we really don't tend to think about mental health, but it's clearly, and I think it's been particularly evident during all the stresses of the COVID epidemic, that mental health and mental life satisfaction is just as important as physical health. The interesting thing that I think we now discovered is these two things are not entirely separate. That, things like exercise can have major effects, not just on cardiovascular health, but can have major effects on cognitive health as well, on neurological disease and neurological aging. So I think we've maybe dichotomized this in a way that really is oversimplifying the real underlying biology that we're just learning about. I mean, 10 years ago, if you had told me, well, if you exercise more, it's going to be good for your brain, I would say, yeah. But now I think it's incontrovertible that that's the case. So I'm sure Dena has a lot to add.
Well, I would agree that that the more and more we learn, the more we understand that that our minds and our bodies don't live in isolation. That and the more of an integrated approach we're taking in biology and in medicine. And I like to say that what is good for the heart is good for the mind. And that includes things that Steve has mentioned: exercise as number one, diet, social connections, keeping the stress low, as some key aspects of living longer and better for both the mind and the body. But there are some things that are falling into categories. And that is another thing that Steve mentioned earlier, is that later in life, women tend to be more frail, but their minds tend to be sharper, looking at older age. Now, it is true, once a man has lived to a very old age, like this is an exceptional man. You know, he really has lived beyond average lifespan and has evaded many diseases. So to keep that in mind, that men that live very long are really quite robust men. But in general, women will have, in normal aging in many populations, a little less cognitive decline than men. And we are wondering why and how. On the social front, we know that women tend to form social networks more than men, particularly into aging, but also on, you know, in our really reductionistic biologic approach to an understanding of sex differences. There, you know, the two X's, what is it about having two X's compared to one X? Because the reality is that one of those X's of the two X's that females have is silenced in development. So even though women harbor two X chromosomes, there's only one actually active. Now we've come to understand that that second X isn't totally asleep and dormant, that it is also making X genes and it's expressing X genes. And so overall, women will express more X genes compared to men. Now, that becomes really important because we now understand that there are more brain-related genes on the X chromosome than any of the other autosomes or any other part of our genetic code, that in some ways there's a concentration of brain genes on the X chromosome. So that might actually end up being important in brain aging and may help in conferring a female advantage in brain aging and maintaining sharp cognitive functions.
Yeah, that is a really compelling fact that I did not know at all before this conversation. I feel like each answer is kind of unpacking. I don't want to speak for Sarah, but I feel like both of us are both like, wow, okay, cool. I want to kind of go back to one point you were talking about, Dena, in terms of evasion of diseases. And I think that that's another way that we want to maybe unpack some of these sex differences. So how would you say that sex differences play out in terms of contracting diseases versus surviving diseases?
Well, that's a good question, and it really depends on the disease. I will speak for the brain as a first round, and There are sex differences in neurologic diseases of aging. There are major sex differences. For example, in multiple sclerosis, there are many more women compared to men. It is an autoimmune disease, and women are more susceptible to contracting would not be the right word. It implies infection, but they're at risk of developing multiple sclerosis more than men. Now, Parkinson's disease is the opposite. It is a higher risk of getting Parkinson's disease in men compared to women. Alzheimer's disease, one of our major neurodegenerative conditions, it also affects the sexes differently. And I'm going to take a moment to just go through the epidemiology of Alzheimer's disease, which is one of our, again, major age-related conditions for which there is no effective therapy for this devastating disease that really erodes the brain. If we look at all living people today with Alzheimer's disease, 2/3 of them are women and 1/3 are men. And that immediately leads us to wonder, well, who's vulnerable and who's resilient? Now, when we look at the risk of getting Alzheimer's disease, men and women are pretty similar up until age 80, and then women have a higher risk. Now, once an individual gets Alzheimer's disease, the biggest risk factor for progression to death is male sex. And so when males get it, they die faster from it, and women will live longer with it, which leads to, in part, more women having the disease, along with increased risk in later life. So lots of, and then we can break that down. Well, who has more of the Alzheimer's toxins in their brain? Who is more resilient to those toxins in their brain? And these are the sort of questions that we are just now asking. Multiple teams around the world are just now asking because, again, if we can understand some aspect of what makes a brain resilient, then maybe we can develop therapies based on that resilience against diseases for which there are no therapies. So sex differences are more than just interesting. They may, again, lead the way to new treatments in medicine.
Yes, if I could maybe pick up on another aspect, which is infectious diseases. We probably already are aware that men do not do as well. If they're infected by COVID, they're more likely to be hospitalized. Once they're in the hospital, they're more likely to go to ICU. Once they're in ICU, they're more likely to be put on a respirator, and they're about twice as likely to die once they've gotten the disease. And that's not unusual. That is something that's happened throughout history. In Iceland in the 19th century, there was a measles epidemic that killed 80% of all the girl babies. And you think, wow, that's something. Turns out, though, it killed 90% of all of the male babies. So there's something, we think there's something, this is very clear differences in the immune system between men and women. You might, I like to think of this as women's immune system is very much, it's powerful and it's primed to respond very, very quickly. Because it does that, it can offer some protection against infectious diseases. But by being primed to be tripped so quickly, it's like a smoke alarm that may go off when it shouldn't. And you end up with these autoimmune diseases like Dena was talking about with MS. So that's one of the best described differences between males and females, I would say, is the differences in the immune system. Maybe having to do with pregnancy, it's easy to attribute a lot of these things to pregnancy. One of the key differences that I like to think about recently is women have cells from other individuals floating around in their body. That is, when you have a baby, that baby, a few of those baby cells will enter the maternal circulation. After the baby's delivered, they'll still have that. You may have cells from babies that have been spontaneously aborted early on. And it goes in the opposite direction too. So we have cells from our mothers that we inherited. But women have this constellation of very small amount, but very real number of cells from a variety of other individuals circulating in their body. It kind of blows your mind. You start thinking about this too seriously. How many cells from my grandmother might I have, in my brain somewhere? But I think that this may turn out to actually have a bigger effect on these sex differences, because those things are going to have small impacts on the immune system.
That is so interesting that perhaps the cells of my son are going to contribute to a long life for me, to put it way too simply. Just saying. But because, it's interesting now that you bring that up about women in pregnancy, because I think it might be interesting to also think about, since we're aging all the time, could you speak to differences between men and women in their health and longevity at middle age versus an older age? Do we see any differences there, Steve?
Well, the huge difference is in the teenage years. There's this phenomenon I call testosterone dementia, and all men know this, from about the ages of 12 to about the age of 30, you're completely mad, crazy. I was a lion. I trained lions at that point in my life. So I was totally nuts. And you can watch, if you look at the pattern of mortality, there's this huge bump in male deaths through the teenagers and the early years. Once that settles down by about 35 or 40, then men and women still survive better, but they just sort of move in parallel. As we get older, your chances of dying double every 8 years. That's what your life insurance will tell you, right? And it's true for men and it's true for women, but the chances that a man will die in the next 8 years and a woman will die in the next 8 years, much greater for the man than the woman. And that continues pretty much until very, very late in life. I mean, the 10 longest live people ever recorded were 100% of them were female. And that's no accident. I mean, the implications of this are the following. If men die at higher rates, at older and older ages, there's more and more dominance by women. Women come to dominate the numbers, which means that the really severe health problems, the complicated health problems, multiple diseases and disabilities that occur to many people late in life, that burden falls primarily on females. Because again, the males grabbed their chest, they fell over 20 years earlier. So it's sociologically, there's a serious disparity in medical interventions that are required for one sex versus the other.
Great. Wow. Dena, anything to add about life's?
Yeah. I mean, puberty. I have a 12-year-old daughter, and we are reading every night a book that says it's perfectly normal, and it is. It is a crazy time of change, really driven by hormones. And I would say the next crazy time that comes is in middle age, particularly for women, where in a very conserved, I would argue evolutionarily conserved manner, age 51, on average, women undergo the menopause, in which hormone levels dramatically decline, estrogen and progesterone. I say maybe provocatively that this could be evolutionarily driven because it's such a specific period, and it's not random. Some people have menopause at 35, others at 65. No, it's like 51 on average. And one could ask, what could be the advantage of a woman undergoing menopause and losing hormones around that time? And many people would agree the advantage is not bearing the risks of having children, but being able to live longer so that one can take care of their children, help them to live longer, and their grandchildren, which helps one's genetic pool to live on. And that could be actually, that it forms the basis of evolutionary theory of why women may live longer than men, with this possibility of really helping one's genetic pool to live longer and to survive more. So, I add in there the menopause, and I think that we would be remiss to not mention andropause also. There's actually a pretty substantial decline in free testosterone. Total testosterone declines some in aging, but when you look at the free testosterone, which is the amount of testosterone that's circulating and active and not bound up by other proteins, that also declines dramatically in aging, and more gradually through middle age and in older years compared to the female precipitous decline in estrogens and progesterones. But these declines have still under study effects on our health, brain and body. In women in particular, some of the strongest evidence that the menopause really affects aging is osteoporosis. Estrogens are really important in brain and bone health, and the loss of estrogens really accelerates and puts many women at risk for osteoporosis or brittle bones in aging. So yeah, middle age is a transition into aging, and hormones are important. But their loss isn't the end of the world. Their loss, and it may even be good in an evolutionary context.
That's a great concept. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you.
I appreciate both of you taking the time to unpack some of the differences in terms of longevity factors. I think just changing gears slightly for a moment and kind of moving into maybe the more service side of the conversation. Steve, I'm curious if there's anything in particular that men should be doing to protect themselves in terms of aging.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. And it's one of the things that I think we're just beginning to understand. Like I say, now that we have on the order of 8 or 9 drugs that we know in experimental animals make them live longer, and there almost are always sex differences, sometimes huge sex differences, has no effect in one sex and other. There's ultimately likely to be things, but for what we know right now, I think the boring stuff that your mother probably told you, which is to stay active, eat right, don't smoke, drink sensibly, all of those things are probably, but I would put the emphasis on exercise. And one of the things about exercise is that the effects on longevity are pretty small. The effects on quality of life are not. The effects on quality of life are huge. So if you want to be able to do the things you like to do, if you want to be able to carry your grandkids up the stairs, if you want to be able to go hiking with them, then you really can't do much better than stay really active. We think of exercise as something that we purposely go out and do for our health, mental health or physical health. But for most of our evolutionary history, exercise was life. A friend of mine now calls it exercise deficiency is what modern people have, that we've gotten away from what we've done for most of our evolutionary history. Our bodies are designed to be active all the time, not necessarily to be running marathons. One of the interesting things is if you look at all the centenarian studies, people live to be 100 or more. There aren't any marathon runners among those people. There is, by the way, a marathon record for 100-year-olds, by the way. It's pretty slow, but the fact that it exists, I think, is absolutely astonishing. But staying active is so important. And I think if people take away anything from this, it would be, I don't care if you're a man or a woman, stay physically active. It will improve every aspect of your life.
Dena, what about you? What would you say to women? We can't rest on our laurels, right?
Right. Well, I couldn't agree more about exercise. And there are many studies. One comes to mind from Stanford that showed that that consistent runners gained 16 years of health span, of like good life, by not having cancers, by not having cardiovascular disease compared to their counterparts who are not doing like good, moderate to intense physical activity. It is a game changer in one's health and in aging. And then the other things that we spoke about, if we think through the lens of brain health, and in diseases like Alzheimer's disease, age-related diseases, it's estimated that 30 to 40% of our risk for these age-related brain diseases is mitigated by lifestyle. That is exercise, social connections, keeping the brain stimulated through choose your love of learning languages, puzzles, having a nice dinner with close friends, brain stimulation, physical activity, eating right, and keeping the stress low contribute in a major way to quality of life and health span. And as you used the word evading earlier, really evading devastating diseases of aging, like Alzheimer's, like cancer, like cardiovascular disease, and more. We live, currently we've lived longer now compared to the early 1900s. We've nearly doubled lifespan, nearly. But now we live a third of our lives in this state of risk for chronic illness. So our challenge, again, male or female or anywhere on the continuum, our challenge for all is to how are we going to live a very healthy life and increase our health span so that we die at 90 of pneumonia, but with a clear, sharp mind, and not of cancer, not of cardiovascular disease, and certainly not of degenerative conditions like Alzheimer's or frontotemporal dementia.
Right. That's a dream, right? And and maybe we're moving there. And I'd love to know actually what each of you are most excited about in this field of research. What do you think we might learn in the next 10 or 20 years? Steve, what do you think?
Wow. Well, I have this famous wager with someone about when the first 150-year-old person will be alive. And my side of the wager is that person is already alive. Now, since no person has lived beyond about 122 and a half years, that means that some of the therapies that develop that are going to take us from living 80 or 90 to 100, 120, 130 are going to have to happen fairly quickly. To me, the most exciting thing that's occurred in the last decade of aging research is the learning that things that we do, even if we start them late in life, can have an enormous benefit to health. And so, we have given mice drugs that we knew kept them healthy longer, but not given them any until they were the human equivalent of 70 or 75 years old. And we might have increased their remaining life by 50%. Nobody would have expected that. I don't think anybody would have expected if you took up weightlifting when you were 90, that it was actually going to improve your strength, but it does. And so to me, the thing that's most exciting is that things that we start doing later in life, including taking new breakthrough drugs or other interventions, can have a major impact on our future health.
Fascinating. Dena, what about you? What's coming?
I think, my gosh, the field of aging is full of amazing discoveries by amazing scientists from all over the world. And it's very hard to prioritize. I am excited by it all, and it is really fascinating. I think in thinking about what the first thing I think about in the morning and the last thing I think about, and even getting back to sex differences in aging, I think coming back to this deep understanding, a deep biologic understanding of what underlies female longevity and what does that second X chromosome do? And could there be new therapies for aging or for brain health on that second X chromosome? Is a personal mission of mine in terms of our research program and the sort of things that I think and dream about. I'm really excited about sex differences and the potential they hold for better understanding aging and for opening up new pathways to brain health and to better health.
If I could just follow up, because that's a really interesting thing that Dena said. And one of the advantages of looking across the animal kingdom at aging is that females don't live longer in every species. In some species, males live longer and quite consistently longer. But in studying those species and comparing them with the species in which females live longer, that's also a tool for investigating what is it exactly in humans that women are doing that makes them survive so much better under any conditions. Can we do that to men? That would be wonderful.
So, I mean, I feel like we have covered so much ground in this conversation, and I just want to say thank you for that, for not only the depth of your answers, but kind of the breadth of information that we've been able to cover. And I know that we have a bunch of great questions from the audience, so we'll get to that shortly. But before we do that, I'd like to pose a question to both of you. What's a final idea or message that you'd like people to leave with today?
I would say that understanding one of the most robust features of human biology, which is this sex difference in aging, is an understudied phenomenon that we have a lot to learn that would benefit both sexes if we understood it better.
Yeah, I'll take a step back and even further back. And though I'd love to say a lot about the second X, I'd like to say that our aging is so modifiable, male or female, that, you know, we have this clock that ticks within us and we age every day, but that rate of aging is not fixed. And we can speed it up with cigarettes and poor health choices and inactivity and stress, or we can slow it down with exercise and good diet and good social connections. And again, choose your joys, the piano, good dinners. And that it's really the mission of most aging researchers to understand how we can achieve a healthier, not just longer, not just to live to 150, but really a healthier life, because the things that help us to live longer tend to help us live better. And so studying aging and studying sex differences and what they will teach us is really a major priority in human health.
Thank you. Excellent. Fascinating conversation. We've had so many good questions come in. We're going to try to take a few in the next, 10 to answer as many as we can. So let's see. The first one here that I'm going to pose is, are there, and you'll correct my pronunciation, you experts, geroprotectors or therapeutics on the horizon that show sex-specific effects on health span? That sounds very interesting. Someone take that.
Well, I'll just say that in mice, so for humans, we're not really at the stage yet where we're testing these things out in humans. We're very close, and there are actually some small studies underway already. But we've done a lot of this in mice. And yes, there's tons of them. They almost all have, well, tons of them. There's a couple of handful of them that we know about. And yes, the ones that lengthen life tend to also enhance and preserve health. I almost think of it like, your function declines and declines and declines. And when it hits some line, then that's it. And so if you extend the time out, then you have to slow the rate of decline as well. So usually those things, quality of life, quantity of life, go hand in hand. Not always, but usually.
Thank you. Great.
The next question that we have is, are there any studies about transgender and how their uniqueness and or use of hormone, including hormone suppression therapy, affects aging?
This is a wonderful question and really gets at the intersection of sex biology, hormones, culture, gender. And I have to say, this is a major limitation in our current studies. Again, we don't have cohorts large enough actually to understand this question of, for example, could hormones help to lengthen lifespan in transgender or cis or trans males or females? We just don't have the data to know. And again, a major limitation in our study of gender and of sex biology. But great question. And I feel that there's enough of importance around these questions that we will know the answers once we have large enough groups to understand who is living longer.
Thank you.
Great. Someone else asked if you could talk briefly about sex differences in adult stem cell aging, which I don't know anything about. So hopefully you can fill them in, and all of us.
I don't believe we know a great deal about sex differences in adult stem cell age. So all your organs have stem cells. We used to think they were very rare. It turns out they're all over the place. And they're responsible for keeping tissues healthy, because cells are always getting sick and dying and you need to replace them. But I don't think there's been much emphasis yet. Maybe Dena knows some research that I don't, on exactly how male and female stem cells differ. I'm just not aware of that. There's lots of them. It's a very active area of study. Well, lots of people are looking at it, but I don't think the focus has really yet been on sex differences in it. Dena, do you?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Now, there are studies that do isolate cells, not particularly stem cells, but isolate cells from different parts of the body, for example, the brain. And we see in our certain mouse studies that when we take XX cells from the brain, not necessarily stem cells, but brain cells, neurons, these XX neurons will survive longer than the XY neurons in a dish. In the absence of culture, in the absence of politics. It again lends to the incredible biology that is to be discovered behind sex differences and longevity, even at the cellular level. I think we will learn more about stem cells and sex differences, but we're getting there.
Another great question from our audience. Aside from hormonal and genetic differences, are there other biomarkers that can influence age-related diseases?
I'm not really sure that I understand that question. Usually biomarkers are things that tell us about the status of aging or diseases. So I'm not exactly sure what the nature of that question is. Let me just point out something though. One of the things that's happened during COVID is there are these differences among different ethnicities in the US in longevity. One of the ones that I think very few people know about is that life expectancy pre-COVID was about 3 years longer for Hispanic Americans than for Caucasian Americans. Longer, not shorter. But of course, the Hispanic population, African American population have been hit much harder by COVID, something that's really interesting to understand more about, such that there's no longer a life expectancy difference between Caucasians and Hispanic Americans. It's fallen to the same. And of course, the difference with African American ethnicities has grown because they've been hit very, very hard by it as well.
Yeah, I think it's a good time to just pause and to mark that there are so many influences on health and life and lifespan, and that as Steve mentioned, and is highlighted by how COVID has affected our different vulnerable populations, there is not equality. There's not equality in the way that our cultural systems and politics affect different vulnerable populations. And even at baseline, it's shocking and awful how Black males live the shortest of the many different populations, and of white, Hispanic, non-Hispanic, that at baseline there is shorter lifespan in Black males for reasons that are just difficult to even stomach, that have to do with politics and equality.
Thank you, Dena, for pointing that out, and Steve for bringing that up. Really important message and reminder. Before we sign off, I'm going to bring up one last fun, interesting question. How do we think that sex differences that benefit females, can they potentially be exploited for the benefit of everyone? What would you say to that before we go tonight?
I think I would say absolutely. I mean, that one of the reasons that Dena does the studies she does is to try to figure out why there is this female sex advantage. I can say as a male, I would love to take advantage of that. I would be delighted for her to tell me, oh yes, we have discovered it, and now I'm going to give you all the survival prowess that all we women have had all along.
I mean, the answer, yes, yes, yes. You know, that is one of the major rationales for studying sex differences, to understand what makes one sex more resilient. In some cases, that's men, some cases, that's women. And we've talked a lot about female resilience today and longevity, but if we can understand that biology, let's harness that for men and women to live longer and better. This is more than just interesting and fascinating. It's really critical for the future of human health.
It is. Thank you. And it is also fascinating. So
yes, it's both.
Important and fascinating. And I cannot thank you both enough for your incredible insights today. Spencer and I think, are just full of, great ideas for the future of bringing more this great information to wide audiences, and this incredible audience here today. Loved seeing your questions, loved seeing people chat with each other in the chat. So thank you everyone for being here, for being part of the Live Better Longer series, which we will be continuing in 2022. So we hope to see you all then, and thank you. So thank you again. To our panelists, especially to our audience, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day.